Lieutenant Danielle Rourke lifted the mop bucket with both hands and poured 30 liters of gray water down the corridor Riley Vance had just finished. It spread fast under the boots of 12 trainees pressed flat against the wall, and not one of them moved. Rourke dropped the mop at Riley's feet and said, "It's dirty again, do it over." Riley looked at the water. Then she looked up, and what was on her face was not shame and it was not anger. It was the stillness of a person who had already decided that today was not the day. She bent down and picked up the mop. Subscribe now, stay with me to the very end, and drop the city you're watching from. In the comments, I want to see how far this story travels. Riley Vance had been invisible at Kestrel Point for 7 months, and every single day of it had been a decision. She badged in at the service gate at 4:40 in the morning before the galley crew, before the watch turned over, before anyone in a uniform had a reason to look at the badge clipped to the waistband of her camouflage trousers. She pulled her cart out of the maintenance bay. She filled the bucket. She pulled her hair back into the same tight ponytail we had worn every morning of her adult life. Brown blonde, a little wave in it that never fully surrendered to the elastic, and started the West Loop. Nobody spoke to her. That was the entire point. There were people on that base who had walked past her 400 times and could not have told you the color of her eyes. They could have told you she was young, 25, maybe younger, that she wore the same olive green t-shirt most days, that she moved fast and never made small talk. That was the whole file. She was the girl with the cart. She was furniture that pushed itself. And Riley had built that, deliberately, carefully, the way you build anything that has to carry weight, slowly correcting for every place where it might crack. Because the truth was that Riley Vance had not come to Kestrel Point to disappear from the world. She had come to disappear inside it, 12 meters from a machine that held the only thing she still wanted. She had 89 days left to reach it. She did not know yet that a man she had never spoken to was about to take 80 of them away from her in a single memo. The first crack showed on a Tuesday, and it showed because of a compressor. Riley was mopping outside the dive locker when the high-pressure bank came up to load, and something in the sound went wrong. A stutter in the second stage, a half-beat late on the backstroke, the kind of irregularity that a person who has never bled money and sleep into a dive log would never register at all. She stopped pushing. She stood there for 4 seconds, head slightly turned, and then she walked to the shop door and knocked twice. The technician who opened it was a kid named Bishop, with grease to his elbows, and he looked at her the way people looked at her, which is to say briefly. "Yeah, your number 2's dropping load on the backstroke," Riley said. "Not every cycle, about 1 in 5. Bishop's face did something complicated. "You heard that?" From the hallway. From the hallway. He almost laughed. Then he didn't, because he'd been standing 3 feet from that machine for an hour and had heard nothing at all, and because there was something in how she said it that left no room for a joke. He went back inside without answering. Riley picked up her mop and finished the quarter. 2 hours later, the shop pulled number 2 off the line with a cracked intake valve that would have failed catastrophically inside a week. And Bishop told exactly one person about it, and that person was Senior Chief Marcus Dean. Dean was 44 and had spent 19 of those years teaching people to stay calm at depths where calm was the only thing keeping them alive. He walked with a hitch in his left leg from a knee that had been rebuilt twice. He did not gossip, and he did not speculate. When Bishop told him the story, he said, "Huh," and went to get his coffee. He thought about it for 3 days. The second crack was a tag, and it nearly killed a man. Riley was pulling trash in the gas analysis room when she saw it. 2 cylinders staged for a morning dive, both banded, both signed off, both tagged in what looked like the same hand. Except she had been in that room every day for 7 months, and she knew how the fill technician made his numbers, and the second tag had a 4 closed at the top instead of open. 2 different people had signed the same batch, which meant somebody had backfilled a signature after the fact, which meant nobody had actually watched that bottle get filled. She stood there with a garbage bag in her hand and did arithmetic that nobody had paid her to do in 3 years. Then she set the bag down, pulled both bottles, walked them to the analyzer, and ran them herself. The second one was hot, not dangerous at the surface, not alarming to look at, but at the depth those trainees were going to hit in 90 minutes, it was a seizure and a drowning and a folded flag on a woman's kitchen table. Riley did not report it. Reporting it meant a form. A form meant a name. A name meant a maintenance contractor who somehow knew how to operate a partial pressure analyzer. And that was a thread that led all the way back to a night off a coast she was not permitted to say out loud. So she did the only thing available to her. She swapped the tags. She wrote the correct mix in block capitals with her left hand, put the hot bottle back in the fill queue where the next audit would catch it and carry the garbage out. Nobody died that day. Nobody knew there had been anything to survive. The trainee who breathed off that bottle finished his dive, ate dinner, called his mother about a car he was thinking of buying, and never learned that a woman with a mop had stood between him and the end of his life for about 90 seconds. Riley finished 11 minutes behind schedule and made it up on the stairwells. Dean found the corrected tag 2 days later on a walkthrough. He looked at it for a long time. The block capitals lean left. Every fill technician on that base was right-handed. He checked twice. He did not tell anyone about that either. But that night he opened a drawer, took out a notebook he had not written in for 2 years, and wrote one word on a clean page. Who? The third crack is 22 kilos of lead, and it happened in front of 9 witnesses. Somebody had stacked weight belts 3 deep on the high rack instead of 2, and when a trainee yanked the bottom one free, the whole column came off the shelf. Head height, 9 people in the room. Riley had her back to it. She turned into the fall, not away into. Her left hand came up and caught the top belt by the webbing. The mass of it dropped her shoulder and rotated her a quarter turn. She absorbed it through her hips and set it down on the deck. It took a second and a half. The room went silent. One of the trainees said, "Holy, restack that shelf," Riley said, and walked out with her card. Dean was in the doorway. He had seen the whole thing. And what stayed with him was not the catch. Plenty of people had fast hands. What stayed with him was that she had turned toward the sound before her eyes found the source, that she had rotated to take the load through the strongest line instead of the nearest one, and that afterward her breathing had not changed, not a hitch, not a gasp, nothing. He had seen a human being do that exactly twice in 19 years. Both times the person doing it had a job that did not appear in any document a civilian could request. That night, Marcus Dean did not sleep well. Here is what nobody at Kestrel Point understood about Riley Vance, and what made every insult she absorbed there far more expensive than any of them could have priced. She was not passive, she was not slow, she was not soft. At 22, she had been the youngest combat diver in a detachment that officially did not exist, and she had done things in cold black water that would have hollowed out most of the men who laughed at her in the galley. She had a body that remembered everything and a mind trained never to stop cataloging. Every time somebody spoke to her, like she was simple, something in her had to be physically restrained. She restrained it every time for 7 months. Because behind a door she cleaned every single morning, there was a machine. The recompression chamber at Kestrel Point ran on an old integrated monitoring system that automatically logged depth profiles, gas mixes, and treatment tables. And because that system was classified as engineering equipment rather than operational record, its server had never been audited, reviewed, or purged. Every profile it had ever pulled was still sitting on it going back years, including one from a night 2 years ago when 3 men went into the water with Riley Vance and only she came out. The official report said Petty Officer Sam Okafor had made a navigation error at depth that killed himself and 2 others. Riley had been the only surviving member of that team. She was the only human being on Earth who had been in the water when it happened. And she was the only person who had refused to sign that report. They had let her go quietly for it. No court-martial, no headline, no ceremony. A separation packet, a handshake nobody meant, and 1 sentence in her file that would follow her for the rest of her life. So she had spent a year finding out where that data physically lived. And when she learned it lived at Kestrel Point, she applied for the only job on that base that would hand her a key to every room in the building and a reason to be inside all of them at 4 in the morning. She had cleaned their floors for 7 months to get within arm's reach of the truth about a dead man. And every Thursday night, she drove 40 minutes to sit in June Okafor's kitchen and tell her it was still coming. June was 34. She had a boy named Elias who was 6 and did not remember his father's face without a photograph. She poured Riley coffee she never finished, and she asked the same question every week. "How long now?" 89 days. June turned the mug in her hands. "Last spring you said 140. It moves. It's tied to their audit cycle." Riley kept her voice flat because flat was the only way she could say any of it. I need supervisor-level credentials to pull an engineering archive. The only clean way to get them is the maintenance certification review. That's in 89 days. I sit the review, I get the tier, pull the file, I hand it to somebody who can't bury it. And if you just walked in and asked, then I'm a fired contractor and the data's gone in a week. You don't know that. I do know that. Riley finally looked up. June, there's one copy. There is no backup. There's no paper. There's no second machine. If I move early and I'm wrong about who I hand it to, we don't get another one, ever. Nell was quiet a long moment. You know what people say about him, she said. At the commissary, at the school gate. They say it careful so I can hear it but can't answer it. 2 years of people being kind to me about the worst lie I've ever been told. I know. Do you sleep? Riley considered lying and didn't. Not really. Which brings it back to Lieutenant Danielle Rourke. Rourke was 29 and the best combat swimmer instructor Kestrel Point had ever produced. That was not opinion. She held pool records nobody had come near in 6 years. She was fast, she was hard, she was fair to her trainees in a way that made them love her, and she carried herself like a person who had never once in her life been the second best human being in a room. She had noticed Riley Vance on Riley's fourth day. She had gone completely still for 3 full seconds when she did. And then slowly and steadily, over 7 months, she had started to grind her down. It began small, a redirected task, a comment in a corridor, a trash can moved 3 feet so it would have to be moved back. By month 4, it had teeth. By month 6, it had an audience. And on a Wednesday afternoon in the galley with 40 people eating, Rourke leaned back in her chair and pitched her voice to Carrie. Hey, car girl. She waited until Riley stopped. Serious question. You ever actually been in open water, like past the second buoy? Somebody laughed before Riley answered. That was the part that mattered. They laughed before. They already knew the shape of the joke and had already agreed to it. Riley set down the tray she was clearing so it wouldn't rattle. I have some experience, she said. The room broke. And it wasn't cruel, which was what made it worse. It was easy laughter. Comfortable laughter. The laughter of people who know they're watching something slightly unfair and have decided it isn't theirs to stop. 40 people in that room, 2 of them senior enough to end it with one word. Riley picked up the tray and walked out. Rourke did not laugh. She sat there holding a fork she wasn't using, and her jaw was locked tight enough to see from across the room, and she watched the door long after Riley was gone. Dean saw that too. He filed it away and did not understand it, and it bothered him for weeks afterward, the way a wrong note bothers a musician. He tried a conversation exactly once. He caught her at the supply cage restocking the cart, and he leaned on the frame the way a man leans when he has nowhere to be. Vance? Senior chief. There it was again. She'd given him his rate without looking at his collar. No glance, no hesitation. She just knew the way you know a street name in your own neighborhood. 7 months, right? About that. You like it here. Riley actually thought about it. He could see her do it, which was rare. It's quiet, she said. That's a hell of a word for this place. Depends what kind of noise you're used to. Dean let that sit between them. You caught 22 kilos of lead out of the air Tuesday, he said. Offhand, back turned. The pause was maybe a second, not more. It would have hit somebody, Riley said. Yeah, Dean said. It would have. He pushed off the frame. Have a good day, Vance. He walked away and did not push, because pushing was how you lost people, and because 19 years had taught him that the ones who don't want to be found usually have a reason worth respecting. But back in his office, he opened the notebook again and wrote 3 lines beneath the word he'd left there. Compressor, tag, belt, then a 4th. Who is she running from? He would turn out to be wrong about that, but not by much. The night everything began to compress. Riley was in the water and nobody knew it. It was supposed to be nothing. A night familiarization swim close in 4 pairs inside the buoy line. 2 safety boats, Rourke on the pier with a radio. Riley was working the locker room 30 meters from the seawall with a mop in her hand when the shouting started. She heard it before the boats did. She heard the pitch of it, not a drill shout, not an instructor's bark, but the specific ragged sound a 22-year-old makes when he realizes the person next to him has stopped moving. Riley was over the wall before she made a conscious decision about it. She hit the water in a t-shirt, trousers, and boots. And she did not surface swim toward the lights because the lights were where everyone was already looking, and the lights were wrong. She read the set of the swell against the pilings, ducked, and went under 12 meters left of where every eye on that pier was pointing. She found Corporal Theo Kessler at 4 meters, tangled in a length of discarded net that had wrapped his ankle and his right arm. He was one bad decision from panic and about 40 seconds from taking water. She did not fight the net first. That was the thing that separated her from everyone on that pier. She got in front of his face, put her palm flat and hard against his chest, and held it there until his eyes locked onto hers and stopped rolling. Then she took the breath out of her own lungs and gave it to him. He steadied. She freed the ankle, then the arm. She pushed him up along the dark side of the piling, and when the safety boat's light finally swung that way, she was already gone. Under along the wall, back to the ladder she'd come off. Kessler surfaced 30 feet from his swim buddy, coughing hard. The buddy grabbed him. The boat got them both. The entry in the log said Corporal Kessler had been recovered by his partner. Kessler let that stand for about 10 hours because he had seen a woman's face at 4 meters in the dark with brown blonde hair coming loose out of a ponytail, and no mask and no fins and no tank, and she had breathed for him. He found Riley the next morning in the equipment corridor and planted himself in front of her cart and could not get the first word out of his mouth. "Move, please," Riley said. "It was you. You had a rough night, Corporal. You breathed for me." His voice cracked on it, and he hated that it cracked. Nobody breathes for somebody at 4 meters unless they've done it before. Nobody swims away from the boat afterward. "Who are you?" Riley looked at him for a long moment, and for about half a second, Theo Kessler saw something come up behind her eyes that frightened him considerably more than the net had. "I'm the person who cleans this corridor," she said. "Go to your muster." He went. But he did not stop watching her after that, and he told exactly one person. And that person told Dean. And Dean sat down slowly in his chair when he heard it and did not get up again for a while. Then came the mop and the 6 people who watched in the silence that Riley would remember longer than the bruise. It happened outside the dive locker at 15:20 on a Thursday. Rourke came around the corner fast, already loaded with something that had nothing to do with a maintenance contractor, and she saw Riley in the cart, and she did not slow down. She took a fistful of Riley's shirt at the collar with both hands and shoved her backward into the cart hard enough to put it over. Cleaner bottles went skidding across the deck. Riley's shoulder hit the wall. Rourke picked up the mop, snapped the handle across her knee, and threw both halves at Riley's feet. There. Her breathing was wrong, too fast, too shallow, nothing like a person in control. That's what you're actually good for, picking things up. 6 people were in that corridor. 2 officers, 1 chief, 3 trainees. Nobody said anything. Riley came off the wall, and this was the moment. This was the moment where every trained instinct in her body was screaming a very specific sequence, a 2-step that would have put a lieutenant on the deck unconscious in under 2 seconds and set 7 months of her life on fire. She let it pass through her and out. She crouched. She picked up the 2 halves of the handle. She put them in the cart. She righted the cart, gathered the bottles, and pushed it down the corridor without looking back. Her hands did not start shaking until she was 2 hallways away and completely alone. Then they shook for 90 seconds, and she stood there and let them, and then she made them stop and finished her loop. Dean arrived 30 seconds late. He got there in time to see the wet streak, the scuff on the wall, and 6 people finding somewhere else to be. He stood in that corridor for a full minute. Then he found the broken half of the handle where it had rolled under the bench, and he carried it back to his office and set it on his desk where he would have to look at it every day. Because he had watched something like that happen to somebody once before a long time ago, and he had also said nothing. He had promised himself that would be the only time. June Okafor heard about it that night, the way she heard everything flat from Riley with all the weather taken out of it. She put her hands on you. Yes. In front of people. 6. June set her mug down hard enough that coffee came over the rim. And you stood there. Yes. Riley, June's voice went thin. Look at me. You are letting them do this to you on purpose, aren't you? Riley didn't answer. You could have ended it in that hallway. You could have ended it in 1 second, and you let her because you need 80 more days inside that building. June's hands were shaking now. I'm asking you to tell me I'm wrong. I can't tell you that. Then tell me it's worth it. Riley looked up, and what came into her face then was the first entirely honest thing anyone had seen from her in 7 months. Sam went into that water because somebody sent him into it, she said. And then they wrote it down that he swam himself into a wall. Elias is going to be old enough to read that report in about 9 years. So yes, it's worth it. It's worth 100 hallways. June covered her mouth with both hands and cried, and Riley sat there and did not touch her because she did not trust what she would do if she started. It should have held 89 days, then 88, then 87. A woman with a cart counting down toward a server nobody had thought about in 2 years. Except that on Friday morning at 07:10, Major Vaughn Prescott came down the administrative corridor and looked at her. Prescott was 41 director of training and the single most well-liked officer on that base. He had a warm voice. He remembered the names of people's kids. He made junior personnel feel taller when he spoke to them. By every visible measure, he was exactly what the Navy hoped it was producing. He had also signed the after-action report on Sam Okafor's death. He came around the corner. He saw a maintenance contractor pushing a cart. His eyes stopped on her for 1 second, maybe less. Riley felt it land on the back of her neck like a hand. She did not freeze. Freezing is what gets people found. What she did was keep her pace exactly the same angle, the cart, and put herself behind the open door of a supply alcove. A movement so small and so natural that nobody in the world would have flagged it except that it removed her from his line of sight at precisely the moment he would have gotten a clean second look. Prescott kept walking. Riley stood in that alcove with both hands flat on the cart handle and counted her own pulse down from 110. Because 7 months of discipline had just told her one thing very clearly. He had not recognized her. She had been in a room with that man exactly once 3 years and 1 lifetime ago. Hair cut short, 40 pounds of gear on her body, one of 11 people at a brief. There was no reason on earth for him to know her face, but something in him had noticed. He hadn't seen a cleaner. He'd seen a 25-year-old civilian move out of an officer's sightline like somebody who had been trained to do it. She finished her loop. She drove home. She slept 90 minutes and woke up twice. And at Borough 455 on Saturday, she badged in at the service gate and the light went red. She badged again, red. The sentry was a kid who had scanned that badge 200 times, and he squinted at his screen with real confusion. Hang on. He typed. He frowned. He typed again. Okay, so you're still active. You're fine. It's just your access tier changed, like overnight. Riley's voice came out perfectly level. Changed how? You're dropped to basic facility, west and south loops. He was apologetic now. No engineering spaces, no equipment, bays, no medical annex. He kept scrolling. That's actually the whole custodial group, not just you. Everybody got dropped at once. Something inside Riley's chest went absolutely still. The medical annex, she said. That includes the chamber suite. Yeah, Chambers Engineering flagged. Sorry, somebody in uniform's gonna have to strip that themselves now, which good luck to them. He hit the override and the gate cleared. There's a memo on the board if you want the actual wording. The memo was on the board. It was 4 lines long. It cited a routine security posture review. It reassigned all engineering space custodial responsibility to a rotating uniform detail effective immediately. And it moved the annual engineering asset audit, the one that ran the retention purge, the one that wiped every legacy log off every unaudited system on that base from its usual date in the spring to the end of the month. 11. At the bottom of the memo was a signature block. V. Prescott Majay, Director of Training. Riley read it 3 times. 7 months, every hallway, every laugh in that galley, the bottle she'd swapped and never spoken about. Kessler's chest under her palm at 4 meters in the dark. Her shoulder hitting the wall while 6 people looked at their boots and said nothing at all. Every hour of it had been an investment against a date 88 days out. And a man who had looked at her for less than 1 second had just moved that date to 11 and moved the only door she had to the other side of a lock she could no longer reach. She did not have 88 days. She had 11. No access, no credentials, no plan. And somewhere down that corridor, past the board, past the dive locker, past the corner where Danielle Rourke had broken a mop handle across her knee, in front of 6 silent witnesses. There was a machine with a dead man's name inside it counting down toward the morning. It would be wiped clean forever. Riley Vance folded the memo into her back pocket, took the handles of her cart, and went to work. She worked the whole loop that morning like a person who had never read anything in her life. That was the discipline. That was the only thing she had left. 11 days had just landed on her like a weight belt off a high shelf, and the single worst thing she could do was let one person on that base see her carry it differently. So she mopped the west corridor. She stripped the south head. She restocked the paper in Building 4. She kept her breathing at the pace of a woman who does not care what day of the month it is. And underneath all of it, her mind ran the problem, the way it had been trained to run problems, which was not in panic but in inventory. She could not reach the chamber suite. That was hard. The badge tier was software, and software was audited. Enforcing it meant a flagged event with her name on it. She could not requisition supervisor credentials in 11 days when the certification review that granted them was 78 days out. She could not walk into Colonel Shaw's office with a story about a dead man and no evidence and expect anything but a phone call to a contractor's HR department, which left the only category she had been avoiding for 7 months. A person, somebody already inside the tier, somebody who could pull an engineering archive without setting off a single alarm. Because for them, it wasn't an intrusion, it was a Tuesday. She had a very short list. She had known the names for months and had refused to write them down even in her own head, because the moment you decide you need somebody, you start deciding they're trustworthy, and Riley had learned exactly what that cost. Sam Okafor had trusted somebody. That was the entire reason Riley now pushed a cart. So she finished the loop and told herself she had 4 days to think about it. She got about 6 hours. At 17:40, that afternoon, a message went out to every custodial contractor on the base requiring attendance at a mandatory water safety orientation at the deep tank, 500 no exceptions, all personnel in appropriate attire. Riley read it twice. There was no such requirement in her contract. There had never been one in 7 months. And the block that generated the message came out of the training directorate, not facilities. She thought about calling in sick and knew immediately that she couldn't. A contractor who ducks a mandatory summons gets a note in a file, and a note in a file gets read by somebody. And right now, the last thing Riley Vance could afford was to become interesting. So at 14:55, she walked into the deep tank house with 11 other contractors, 3 men in their 50s, a woman who ran the laundry, a couple of grounds crew. And the first thing she saw was that there were 19 trainees seated on the bleachers who had absolutely no reason to be at a civilian safety brief. The second thing she saw was Danielle Rourke standing at the edge of the tank with a clipboard, and Rourke was already looking straight at her. Riley understood the shape of the next hour immediately. Rourke ran the first 20 minutes clean, genuinely clean. She talked about tank depth, about pool decks, about what a contractor should do if they find somebody face down in 8 feet of water, and she was good at it. Clear, unhurried, no wasted words. 2 of the older men were nodding along like they were learning something, because they were. Then she got to the demonstration. "I need 1 volunteer for a surface familiarization," she said. "Nothing complicated. You go in, you tread, you clear a mask, you come out." Nobody moved. Of course nobody moved. Rourke waited 3 seconds and then said without looking at her clipboard, "Vance." 12 heads turned. 19 trainees leaned forward, maybe an inch. Riley stood up. She went to the changing room and came back in the wetsuit they handed her, and she stood at the edge of the tank, at the bottom of the ladder. And the whole room was very quiet in the way rooms get quiet when everyone has understood something and nobody is going to say it. Rourke handed her a mask. You know how to clear one of these. I've seen it done." "That's not the same thing." "No," Riley agreed. "It isn't." Somebody up in the bleachers laughed and got an elbow from the trainee beside him. Riley got in the water, and then Riley Vance did the hardest thing she had done in 7 months, which was to be bad at it. Not clumsy. Clumsy is easy to fake and easy to spot. She did something much more specific. She let her legs sink. She let the mask flood too far before she reacted to it. She surfaced early out of sequence, coughing, one hand slapping the deck with the nervous swimmer's hand slaps the deck. The bleachers laughed, not all of them, but enough. She heard one voice from up there say, "Come on, man," in the tone of somebody genuinely uncomfortable. And she never found out which one that was, And for some reason, that was the thing that stayed with her all night. Rourke stood at the edge of the tank with the clipboard against her thigh and did not laugh at all. Again, she said. Riley did it again. Worse. Again. The laundry woman said, "Ma'am, I think that's," and Rourke said, again without turning her head, and the laundry woman stopped. Four times a 25-year-old woman who had held her breath under ice pretended to panic in 8 feet of heated pool water in front of 31 people, and each time it got a little quieter up in the bleachers because a joke that goes 4 rounds stops being a joke and starts being something the room has to decide about. On the 4th time coming up, Riley made a mistake. It was one motion, and it lasted less than a second. The mask flooded, and before her brain caught her body, her right hand came up and cracked the top seal with 2 fingers while she blew out through her nose, clearing the whole thing on a quarter breath in a way that emptied it in one pulse. It was not a technique they taught in that building. It was not a technique they taught in most buildings. She caught herself instantly and dumped the water back in and coughed and slapped the deck. It cost her half a second total. Nobody in the bleachers noticed a thing. Marcus Dean standing in the doorway at the back where he had come in for the last 10 minutes because Bishop had mentioned something offhand about the schedule, noticed all of it. He didn't move. He didn't change his face. But something in his chest went cold and sat there. Riley climbed out. She toweled off. She sat down with the other contractors, and Rourke finished the brief and dismissed everybody. And as the room emptied, Rourke stood at the tank edge and said, "Vance, stay." Riley stayed. The room drained out. Dean left with it deliberately because he had learned a long time ago that you get more from what people do when they think you've gone. When it was just the 2 of them, Rourke said, "You were terrible." "Yes, ma'am." "You were terrible on purpose." Riley's expression did not change by a millimeter. "I don't know what you mean." Rourke stared at her for a long moment. Something moved across her face, something that looked absurdly like grief. "You know what I do all day," Rourke said. "I take 22-year-olds and I find out what they're hiding. That's my entire job. That's the whole thing." Her voice had gone strange. "So don't stand there wet in front of me and tell me you don't know what I mean. I'm a maintenance contractor, Lieutenant." "Yeah," Rourke said, "sure." And then she walked out and left Riley standing there, and Riley did not understand, would not understand for another 11 days that she had just been given a warning by the only person on that base who already knew everything. That night, Riley went back to the base at 2300 and tested the door. Not the chamber suite. She wasn't stupid enough to touch that one. She tested the equipment bay next to it because equipment bay and medical annex shared a corridor, and because if the badge drop was a blanket software change, there was a chance somebody had missed a door. Red light. She tried the service stairwell that fed the annex from below. Red. She tried the mechanical crawl access off the boiler room, which was not a door so much as a hatch, which was not badged at all, and which she had personally cleaned the filters behind 4 times. Somebody had put a new padlock on it. The metal was still bright. Riley stood there in the dark with her hand on that lock and felt something she had not let herself feel in 2 years, which was the specific bottomless drop of realizing that the other side is not slow, is not lazy, and is not lucky. Prescott had not just cut her access. He had cut every route into that room, including the one that wasn't on any drawing, which meant somebody with a floor plan and a very clear head had sat down and thought about how a person might get into the chamber suite without a badge, which meant he wasn't protecting a policy. He was protecting the server. She walked back out through the service gate at 2340, and the sentry didn't look up. She had 8 days when the ocean made its own contribution. It was a night open water evolution, a real one, not a familiarization. Buoy line to the point and back 4 pairs, full kit Rourke in the lead boat. The forecast was a 2-foot swell in a light chop and nothing anybody would think twice about. The forecast was wrong by about 90 minutes. Riley wasn't supposed to be there at all. She had stayed late because staying late was the only way she was going to find a 5th idea, and she was on the seawall side of the equipment bay hosing down a rack when the wind changed. She felt it change. That was the thing. She felt the pressure shift on her face and heard the pitch of the water against the pilings go up a half step, and she stood there with a hose in her hand and said out loud to nobody, "Get them in." 20 minutes later, the radio net went to hell. She heard it through the open door of the boathouse. She heard the safety boat report a pair unaccounted for. She heard the second boat report the same pair sighted then not sighted. She heard Rourke's voice on the net controlled, absolutely controlled, but too fast, calling a search pattern to the north of the point. The current at that point ran south on the falling tide. Riley had cleaned the tide board in the boathouse every week for 7 months. She had read the plate on the wall 100 times without meaning to. She knew standing in a doorway with a hose that 2 young people were being searched for in exactly the wrong direction. And there was no version of this where she picked up a radio and said so. A contractor calls the net and corrects a lieutenant on a current set, and the very best case is that they ignore her. The realistic case is 30 seconds of confusion, which is 30 seconds that 2 kids in the water don't have. So she put the hose down. She took a set of fins and a mask off the rack. Nothing else, no tank, no light, because light was the last thing she wanted, and she went off the low end of the seawall and swam south. She found the first one at 11 minutes. I was on the surface, conscious, and had gotten separated and was doing everything right and going nowhere, and when a hand closed on his harness, "Strap out of black water," he screamed into his own mouthpiece. Riley got in front of his face. She didn't say anything. She pointed twice in the direction of the boat lights, and then she put her palm on his chest, the same thing, the exact same thing she'd done to Kessler, and held it until he stopped thrashing. Then she turned him and pushed him and stayed under and behind him out of the light and did not surface where anyone could see her. The second one was worse. The second one was a woman named Alvarez, who had gone down with a fouled inflator and had come back up under the swim step of the drifting second boat, which meant she was in air pocket she couldn't get out of, and nobody could see her because she was directly beneath the people looking for her. Riley heard her, not with her ears exactly. She heard a wrong rhythm in the hull slap a soft irregular knock underneath a regular one, and she went to it and got under the boat and found a hand and then a face. Alvarez was 5 seconds from doing the thing that kills people, which is inhaling, because the body has voted and the brain lost. Riley did not have a spare regulator. She had nothing at all. So she took Alvarez by the jaw with one hand, put her mouth over hers, and gave her everything she had in her lungs, and then dragged her sideways out from under the hull, along a line she could not see and did not need to see because she had felt the shape of the boat with her forearm on the way in. They came up 8 feet off the swim step. Alvarez took a breath that sounded like a door being kicked in. Somebody on the boat screamed. 2 people went over the rail. Lights swung, and Riley Vance went under. She was gone before the first light hit the water. She swam 80 meters on one breath and came up in the dark under the seawall, and she lay on her back in the surge with her heart going like a hammer and listened to a boat crew pull Alvarez out of the water and lose their minds with relief. Then she climbed the ladder down, put the fins and mask back on the rack exactly where they had been, and picked the hose back up. She was still hosing in the rack when the trucks came down. Nobody looked at her. Nobody looked at her, and she stood there, 25 years old, soaked to the skin, salt in her hair, and watched 20 people run past a woman who had just brought 2 of their own back from the dark. That was the moment. If there was a moment in all of it, that was the one. She would tell June later that she hadn't felt anything at all. That was a lie, and June knew it was a lie and let her have it. Hassan. The story that went into the log was that Alvarez had self-rescued from under the hull. Alvarez told the corpsman and then the duty officer and then anybody who would listen that somebody had breathed for her. Nobody believed her. Deep water night, hypoxia, adrenaline. Everybody nodded kindly and wrote it down as confusion. Everybody except Theo Kessler, who was standing in the back of the boathouse when Alvarez said it and who went absolutely white. And Marcus Dean, who was standing next to him. Dean watched Kessler's face and said quietly, "You wanted to tell me something." Corporal Kessler opened his mouth, closed it. He was 22 years old, and he had a career and a girlfriend and a mother in Ohio. And he had also been told very clearly by a woman in a corridor to go to his muster. "No, Senior Chief," he said. Dean looked at him for a long time. "Okay," he said, "but when you do come find me before you tell anybody else. Understand?" "Yes, Senior Chief." The next morning, Dean went to the boathouse at Duro 500 and did the only thing he could think of. He checked the fin rack. 22 pairs, every pair dry, except one which was on the rack in the correct position, correctly hung, and had a puddle under it the size of a coffee cup lid. Dean stood there looking at a puddle for maybe 4 minutes. Then he went to his office and wrote in the notebook under compressor, tag, belt, one more word, Alvarez. And then he crossed out the line at the bottom, the one that said, who is she running from, and wrote underneath it, wrong question, ask what she's waiting for. 6 days. The thing that broke Rourke happened on a Thursday, and it did not happen because of Riley at all. It happened because Prescott stood up at the weekly training brief and in front of 30 people praised Lieutenant Rourke's textbook execution of the recovery of Alvarez and the other trainee, and then in the same warm, easy voice announced that the incident review had concluded. The evolution had been conducted within acceptable parameters, and that no operational changes were required. Rourke sat in that room and heard a man she had watched sign things before sign this one too. She had put 4 boats in the wrong quadrant. She knew it. She had known it 11 seconds after Alvarez came up on the wrong side of the point, and she had gone home and been sick, and she had spent 2 days writing a self-report she intended to submit. And Prescott had just closed the file with a compliment. She found him afterward. She said she wanted to amend the record. Prescott put a hand on her shoulder, friendly, warmed the way he did with everybody, and said, Danny, listen to me. You did fine. It's closed. Don't reopen something that's going to sit in your jacket for 20 years over a swell that nobody forecast. Sir, the current set was in the report. It's fine. He smiled at her. You know what your problem is? You're the best swimmer this place has ever had, and you still don't think you're allowed to be human. And then he walked away, and Danielle Rourke stood in that corridor, holding a self-report that no longer had anywhere to go, and something inside her that had been cracked for 2 years finally came apart. 20 minutes later, he found Riley in the dive locker corridor. There was no exchange first. That's what made it worse. There was no comment, no setup, no joke. Rourke came around the corner at speed, and she saw a young woman with a cart, and her hands were moving before her mind arrived. She took a fistful of Riley's shirt at the collar with both hands and drove her backward into the cart hard enough to put it over. Bottles went across the deck. Riley's shoulder and the back of her head hit the wall. Rourke picked up the mop off the floor, snapped the handle across her knee, and threw both halves down at Riley's feet. There. Her breathing was ragged. That's what you're for, picking things up off the floor. 6 people in that corridor, 2 officers, a chief, 3 trainees. One of them was Theo Kessler. Nobody said one word. Riley came off the wall slowly, and every single thing in her body was screaming a sequence at her, a real one, a trained one, 3 movements that would have ended with a lieutenant unconscious on the deck and Riley Vance in a holding cell within the hour, and a server wiped in 6 days with a dead man's name still on it. She stood there and let it pass through her. She looked at Rourke. She looked long enough that Rourke's hands came down. You want me to hit you, Riley said. It was so quiet that only Rourke heard it. Rourke's whole face changed. You've wanted it for 7 months, Riley said. I'm not going to. And then she crouched and she picked up the 2 halves of the handle and she put them in the cart and she righted it and she gathered the bottles one at a time while 6 people looked at their boots, and she pushed the cart down the corridor without looking back. Rourke stood there. Then she went into the stairwell and sat down on the 3rd step and put her head in her hands and stayed there for a long time. Kessler followed Riley. He caught her at the end of the corridor and he was shaking. Why didn't you say anything? Why doesn't anybody? His voice broke. There were 6 of us. There were 6 of us. Go to your muster, Corporal. I saw you. He was crying, which mortified him, and in the water, both times. I know it was both times, and I stood there just now, and I didn't. Kessler. Riley stopped the cart. She turned around and she looked at a 22-year-old who was falling apart in a hallway, and something in her softened for about 2 seconds. Listen to me. What she did in that corridor is going to say more about her than about me every single day, forever. All I have to do is not complicate it. That's not, he wiped his face with the back of his wrist. That's not fair. No, Riley agreed, it's not. Her hands started shaking 2 hallways later, and she let them for 90 seconds and then made them stop. Dean arrived 30 seconds too late. He got there in time to see the wet streak, the scuff, and 6 people finding somewhere else to be. He stood in that corridor for a full minute. Then he found the broken half of the handle under the bench and carried it back to his office and set it on his desk where he would have to look at it every day. Because he had watched something like this happen once before 22 years ago, and he had said nothing then either. and he had promised himself that would be the only time in his life. June heard it that night flat with all the weather taken out of it. She put her hands on you. Yes, in front of people. 6. June set the mug down hard enough that coffee came over the rim and her voice went thin. And you stood there. Yes. Riley, you are letting them do this to you on purpose, aren't you? Riley didn't answer. You could have ended it in 1 second and you let her. June's hands were shaking. Tell me I'm wrong. I can't. Then tell me it's worth it. Say it out loud so I can hear how it sounds. And Riley looked up and the honest thing finally came out of her. Sam went into that water because somebody sent him into it, she said. And then they wrote down that he swam himself into a wall. Elias is going to be old enough to read that report in about 9 years, June, so yes, it's worth 100 hallways. June cried into both hands, and Riley sat there and did not touch her because she did not trust what she would do if she started. Then June wiped her face and said, how many days? 6. And you still can't get in? No, you dumb. Then get help. There isn't. Us. Riley, June's voice came out like iron. You've been alone with this for 2 years because the last time you trusted somebody, it cost you everything. I understand that. I live in that. But you are 6 days from losing him for good, and you are sitting in my kitchen telling me you'd rather lose him alone than risk being wrong about a person. Riley didn't answer for a long time. Then she said, there's one man. She went in at 0300 on Sunday, not to the annex. She wasn't going to get in and she knew it. She went in because she had run out of everything else, and she wanted to stand in front of that corridor one time before the audit and know for absolutely certain that she had tried. The badge worked to the main level, it always had. She walked the administrative corridor past the board where the memo still hung, and she stopped at the corner where the engineering wing began the point past which her badge was now decoration. And she saw that the door to the equipment bay was propped open with a wedge, lights on inside. And rolling out through that door on a flat cart was a stack of gray server units, stripped cabled loose tag for disposition. There were 2 men doing it. Neither of them was in coveralls. One of them had a clipboard and was checking asset numbers off a list, and Riley Vance stood in the dark 40 feet away and read the tag on the top unit through a doorway. It was the chamber suite monitoring server. They were not waiting 6 days. They were pulling it that night. She did the arithmetic in about a second and a half, and there was only one answer in it, and the answer was that she had to stop 2 men in a corridor and take a server off a cart, which would end her freedom in about 4 minutes and probably end the evidence with it because a stolen drive proves nothing to anybody. She stepped forward anyway, and a hand closed on her arm from behind. Don't, Marcus Dean said very quietly right at her ear. Not like this. Riley turned. Dean was in civilian clothes, unshaven, and he had a coffee in his other hand that had gone cold hours ago, and he had the look of a man who had been standing in that dark hallway for a while. How long have you been there? She said. Since about 11. He was still watching the 2 men over her shoulder. 3rd night in a row. Why? Because I've been asking myself for 2 months what a woman like you is waiting for in a building like this. His eyes came to hers. And about 4 days ago, I stopped guessing and started looking at what got locked. Down the corridor, the flat cart rolled toward the loading door. Senior Chief, Riley said, and her voice came out lower and faster than it had in 7 months. And that cart is the only copy of a depth profile from a night 2 years ago that proves Sam Okafor did not kill his team. In about 90 seconds, it goes on a truck, and I lose him forever. Dean didn't blink. Okafor, he said, you knew him. I taught him. Dean set the cold coffee down on the floor without looking at it. Vance, what's your rate? I don't have one anymore. What was it? And Riley Vance, for the first time in 3 years, said it out loud to another human being. Petty Officer 2nd Class, Detachment 6. Dean closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he said, stay here. Don't move. Don't speak. And for God's sake, don't let them see your face. And he walked out into the light of that corridor toward 2 men and a cart carrying the only thing in the world Riley Vance still wanted. Shaw slid the folder across the desk and didn't open it. Before I say anything, she said, I want you to know that 4 people told me not to make this offer. Two of them are lawyers and one of them is a friend. Then don't make it, ma'am. I'm going to make it anyway. Shaw sat back. Fleet wants to close your file. Kessel's final report goes up in 11 days, and there's an offer attached to it. Full reinstatement of grade. Back pay to your separation date. The finding vacated in its entirety, expunged, gone. And a non-disclosure instrument covering the circumstances of the correction. Riley didn't touch the folder. Meaning Sam's correction stays inside the family, she said. Meaning the amended finding on Petty Officer Okafor is filed distributed to next of kin and not published. Not published. That's the word they used. Riley finally looked at the folder. She looked at it for a long moment, and Shaw watched a 25-year-old woman decide something that was going to cost her about $400,000 and the only thing she had wanted for 3 years. No, Riley said. Shaw exhaled slowly. I thought you'd say that. His name went into a report that 11 people read and 1,000 people heard about, ma'am. The correction can't live in a drawer, not because I'm angry, because a lie that's public and a truth that's private don't cancel out. They just sit there and the lie's louder. She pushed the folder back. I'm not signing anything until his name is corrected in the same places it was ruined. Ms. Vance, that's the Navy telling you what it's willing to do. Then the Navy can tell me again when I'm still standing here. The Navy sent Rear Admiral Warren Hale. He came on a Thursday with 2 staff officers and a schedule, and he was 61 years old and had approved the original findings in his previous billet, and everybody in that building knew it, and he knew they knew it. He had on the flight up been briefed to expect a difficult former petty officer with a grievance. What he got was a woman in an olive green t-shirt and camouflage trousers who stood up when he entered, said, "Sir," and then said nothing else at all for the first 90 seconds of the meeting because she had been asked no question. Hale sat down. He looked at her. "You've turned down a full reinstatement," he said. "Yes, sir." "Why?" "Because it doesn't correct the thing that's broken, sir. It corrects your record." "My record isn't what's broken." Hale's jaw tightened, and one of the staff officers shifted, and Shaw, standing against the wall, did not breathe. "Let me tell you what happens if we publish," Hale said. "The correction identifies a surface override on a compartmented operation. That means the operation gets discussed. That means 4 agencies and 2 allied services start getting calls from reporters and men who are alive today because that package was recovered, stop being alive at some point in the next 3 years. That is not a hypothetical, Ms. Vance. That is the actual arithmetic on my desk." Riley took that in. She took it in properly. Hale could see her do it, and it was the first thing about her that impressed him. "Then don't publish the operation, sir," she said. "Publish the finding. Those aren't separable." "They're entirely separable." Her voice stayed level. "Nobody outside this room needs to know where the water was or what was in it. What they need to know is one sentence: the previous finding of navigational error against Petty Officer Sam Okafor is vacated. His conduct was correct. That's it. No location, no unit, no operation. Just the sentence that goes in the same places the other one went. And where were those places? His personnel file, his unit's casualty summary, the training case study, sir." And here something got into her voice for the first time. "The training case study." Hale went very still. "There's a case study," Riley said. "It's been taught at 3 schools for 2 years. Navigational error at depth. Sam is a paragraph in it. 19-year-olds have been sitting in classrooms being taught what not to do, and the example is a man who did everything right and got overruled. Nobody in that room said anything." "That's what I want, sir," Riley said. "Not the money, not the grade. I want the case study pulled and rewritten with the actual facts, and I want it taught with his name on it, and I want every kid who sits through it to learn the real lesson instead of the false one." "And what's the real lesson?" "That he called it," Riley said, "and somebody topside said no, and 3 people died, and a whole chain of adults who could have written it down chose not to." Hale sat there for a long moment. Then he turned to one of his staff officers and said, "Get me the schoolhouse curriculum office. Today." The case study was pulled in 9 days. It came back 4 months later as a 14-page instructional package with Sam Okafor's name in the title, and the last section was titled "The Duty to Report Upward," and it contained a sworn statement from a formerly commissioned relay watch officer describing exactly what she had heard and exactly how long she had said nothing. Rourke had insisted her name stay on it. "They'll use it against you forever," Riley told her. "Good," Rourke said. "That's the point of it." Vaughn Prescott's disposition came down in the spring. He was not court-martialed. Riley had known from the first week that he wouldn't be. The operation was compartmented, the witnesses were scattered, and 2 years of erosion had eaten most of what a prosecutor would have needed. He was given the option of retirement in lieu of further proceedings at reduced grade with a permanent bar to any position of instruction or command authority. He took it. He came to see Riley one final time at the visitor gate, and he did not ask to come inside, and he stood there in civilian clothes with a healed line through one eyebrow. "I wanted to say it in person," he said. "Say it. You were right that I traded him." His voice had none of the warmth in it anymore, and without it, he sounded like an ordinary tired man. "I've told myself for 2 years that I made a hard call in a hard hour. And I did. That part's true. But the report wasn't a hard call. The report was 11 days later at a desk with coffee." Riley didn't answer. "That's the part I don't get to keep," he said. "The rest of it I can live with, not that." "Sam's son is 6, Riley said. "I know. His name is Elias." Prescott closed his eyes for a second. "I know," he said. "He left. She never saw him again, and she never once looked him up, and that was the last thing she ever gave him." Shaw made the offer in June. Not reinstatement, Riley had already told her what she thought of a uniform she'd have to put back on to be believed in. "I want a course," Shaw said. Shaw. "Not a lecture, not even a supplemental, a block. 2 weeks mandatory every rotation." "Teaching what?" "You tell me." Riley thought about it for 4 days and came back with 2 pages. The first page was operational degraded condition decision-making. The gap between people who can perform correctly inside structure and people who can perform correctly when the structure is gone. Controlled failure. Scenarios stripped of the anchor's trainees had been taught to hold. She'd been watching it from a cart for 7 months. The lock, the reach for procedure, the 3 minutes lost to hesitation, that in the real world is somebody's family answering a knock. The second page was the one Shaw read 3 times. It was about speaking up. Not as an ethics bill, not as a slide with the word integrity on it, as a tactical skill practice drilled graded the same as a mass clear. How to say, "Sir, I disagree" in 11 words while a boat is going the wrong direction. How to say it to somebody you like. How to say it when 40 people are holding and you're the only one who isn't. Shaw looked up. "You want to grade them on contradicting instructors." "I want to grade them on contradicting instructors correctly," Riley said. "Because right now we're producing people who are technically excellent and structurally silent, ma'am. And I have personally watched what that costs 3 separate times in this building." Shaw signed it. 2 of her senior instructors threatened to resign inside the first week. One of them, a warrant officer named Greg Salas, who had run the advanced track for 4 years, came to Riley directly after the framework brief and skipped the diplomatic version entirely. "This says everything I've built produces cowards. It says everything you've built produces competence inside structure," Riley said, "and that we never taught the second half." "That's not the same sentence, and you know it isn't." "Then say the second half to me." "Come Wednesday." He came Wednesday. He stood against the wall with his arms crossed, and by the end of the first scenario, his arms were down, and by the end of the second, he was leaning forward, and at the end of the session, he walked up to her and said without preamble, "How do I recalibrate what I've been doing?" "Give me an hour Thursday." 0700. 0630, Riley said. "The machine by the east gate makes a better cup. I'll bring donuts." Solace became her most effective collaborator. Inside 3 weeks, and it happened the way every real conversion happens, not through argument, but through evidence. He could not dispute because he'd been watching that same gap in his own trainees for 4 years and blaming it on the kids. The first cohort was 12 people, and one of them was Theo Kessler. He'd asked for it. He'd asked in writing, which cost him something because the request had to explain why. On day 1, Riley ran a scenario with no brief at all. Improvised, asymmetric, deliberately stripped of every cue they'd been trained to hold on to. 3 of them locked and stood there holding a procedure like a map of the wrong city. 4 improvised in the wrong direction. 4 assessed and moved, and one of them, a specialist named Torres, made a call at the 6-minute mark that ended the whole thing. Riley called time. "Torres, minute 6. What did you feel?" "That the procedure was going to cost us the window." "Were you certain?" "No." "But you moved." Standing still was definitely wrong. Moving was possibly right. Riley looked at him for a second. Write that down somewhere, you'll see it every day, she said. Then she turned to the three who had locked. What happened? Silence. I'm not asking for accountability, I'm asking for honesty. What happened when you reached for the procedure and it didn't fit? And a kid in the front said very slowly, I kept trying to make it fit, because if it doesn't fit, I don't know what comes next. Yes, Riley said, that's it. That's the entire thing we're here to fix. Kessler was watching her from the second row with an expression she recognized and chose not to name out loud. At the end of the block, on the last day she ran the second half of the course, the one everybody had been dreading, the one where she put a trainee in a scenario and then had a senior instructor give a confident, warm, completely wrong order and graded the trainee on what they did about it. 9 of the 12 complied, 3 didn't, Torres didn't, Kessler didn't. Kessler said out loud in front of everybody, Sir, I disagree, the current's running the other way, we should be south. And Salas playing, the instructor, said, Corporal, that's not your call. And Kessler said, understood, sir. I'm putting my disagreement on the record, and I'm asking you to reconsider. Riley stopped the scenario there. That, she said, is the hardest sentence in this building. It took him about 4 seconds. It has taken people in this room 2 years. She did not look at anybody when she said it. She didn't have to. The thing that made it travel happened on a Tuesday in October, and Riley Vance was not in the water for it. A civilian fishing boat rolled 10 kilometers off the point in a 4-meter sea at night with 7 people aboard and a distress call that came in broken. Kestrel Point had a night evolution on the water when it happened. Kessler's cohort, Riley on the pier with a radio and Shaw 30 seconds behind her. The lead boat's call came in at 21:41. We have visual hull inverted multiple in the water request instruction. And Riley keyed the radio and said one sentence. Kessler, you're the on-scene commander. Go. Shaw grabbed her arm. He's a corporal. He's 90 seconds from them, and we're 11 minutes out, ma'am. Riley didn't take her eyes off the water. If I run this from a pier, I'm doing exactly what got Sam killed. Shaw let go of her arm. Kessler made his first call at 40 seconds, not 6 minutes, not 3 seconds. He split his boats, put one down current instead of on the hull, which was against every diagram in the standard package. And he did it because he'd read the set the way a woman with a cart had taught him to read it in a classroom 11 weeks earlier. 2 of the 7 had already been carried 300 meters south when they were found. Both were in the down current boat's light inside 4 minutes. All 7 came home. Riley stood on that pier and did not move, and did not say one word into the radio for 19 minutes, and Colonel Eleanor Shaw stood beside her and watched a 25-year-old woman hold her own hand still. When the boats came in, Kessler came up the ladder soaked and shaking and found her, and he couldn't get the first word out any better than the first time. I put a boat down current, he said. I put a boat down current, and the book says, I know what the book says. 2 of them were 300 meters out. His voice cracked. If I'd stayed on the hull, yes, Riley said, you know that, that's why you didn't. And then she said the thing that Theo Kessler would repeat at his own retirement ceremony 26 years later. That's the whole job, Corporal. Somebody's whole family got to keep their Christmas because you thought for 40 seconds instead of 6 minutes. Go get dry. It traveled after that the way real things travel, not through a press release, but because a Coast Guard sector commander wrote 3 paragraphs in an after action, and because 7 fishermen told a local paper about a Navy kid who found them in the dark where nobody was looking. Kessel's office asked for the curriculum in November. 2 other installations asked for it in January. By spring, the block was mandatory at all 3 schoolhouses, and the 14-page instructional package with Sam Okafor's name on it was in front of every trainee who came through any of them. And in March, an envelope arrived that Riley had stopped expecting. The recommendation that had been written 3 years earlier and buried under a classification review had been reopened, revalidated, and approved. It was not a small one. Shaw brought it to her in person and put it on the table and said, You've earned about 4 seconds of me being sentimental, so let me have them. And Riley let her have them. Then Riley read it twice and said, I'll accept it on 2 conditions. Of course you will. 1, Okafor and Gawain and Reyes are named on it, not as context, named. That's already being processed. 2, Riley put her finger on the table. It doesn't hang in the headquarters lobby. Shaw frowned. Where then? The dive locker, on the wall by the equipment racks. That's a service corridor, Ms. Vance. Nobody important walks through there. Everybody who's going to be in the water at 3 in the morning walks through there, ma'am, Riley said. That's who it's for. Not visitors, not the board. The kids pulling their gear at Euro 4:30 with nobody watching them. Shaw opened her mouth to argue and then closed it. Put it in the locker, she said. They hung it on a Friday and about 140 people crowded into a corridor that fit 60. June Okafor came. She wore a blue dress and she held Elias's hand, and Elias was 7 now, and had been told carefully over about a year the true version of who his father was. He read the names on the plate himself. He was a slow reader and nobody rushed him, and 140 people stood in absolute silence while a 7-year-old sounded out his own last name. Then he looked up at Riley and said in the completely direct way children have, "Were you scared?" And Riley Vance, who had answered admirals and colonels and investigators without ever once giving a straight answer about herself, crouched down to his height and said, "Yes, every day for 3 years. But you did it anyway. That's the only way anybody does anything, buddy." June was crying, Shaw was crying and pretending she wasn't. Marcus Dean stood at the back with his arms folded and a jaw like granite, and afterward he came up and handed Riley something wrapped in a shop rag. She unwrapped it. It was the broken half of a mop handle. "I've had it on my desk for a year and a half," he said. "I kept it because I got there 30 seconds late, and I never wanted to forget that 30 seconds was enough time for everybody in that hallway to say nothing." He shrugged, and his voice went rough. "I don't need it anymore. Do what you want with it." Riley looked at it for a moment. Then she walked it over to the equipment rack and set it on the shelf beneath the plate and left it there, and it is there today. Danielle Rourke got her instructor status back 4 years later. She had to fight for it. She had to sit in front of a board and read her own sworn statement out loud again, and she did it without her voice shaking. And when the board president asked her why anyone should trust her judgment, now she said, "Because you have it in writing exactly what my judgment costs, sir. Nobody else in front of you today can say that." Riley wrote her the letter of support. She wrote it in one draft. They taught the block together after that for 6 years, and Rourke always took the second half, the one about speaking up, because she had earned the right to teach it in the worst possible way. And because a room of 19-year-olds hearing a scarred instructor say, "I stayed silent for 2 years," and a man's son grew up believing a lie about his father did more than any curriculum ever written. Riley Vance never put the uniform back on. Fleet asked her twice more. She said no twice more, and the second time Hale himself called and asked her why, and she gave him an answer he thought about for years. "Because they need somebody in that building who doesn't have a rank at stake, sir. The whole failure was a chain of people protecting a position. If I'm in the chain, I'm just one more person with something to lose." She was 31 when the block became mandatory fleet-wide. 34 when the first of her trainees started running their own courses. Somewhere around then, people stopped calling her by any title at all and started just saying the name the way you say the name of a road everybody knows. And she never once in 19 years of teaching opened a course with a story about herself. She opened every single one the same way. She'd stand in front of a room, 12 of them, 20 of them, and she'd say, "Somebody in this room is going to be the only person who sees it. That's not a maybe. Statistically, in a career, it's one of you, probably more. And when it happens, you will have about 4 seconds to decide whether you're a person who says it out loud or a person who tells themselves it wasn't their place. Everything else I teach you in the next 2 weeks is about the water. This is the part that's about you." They laughed at the janitor for 7 months, and then a corridor full of them stood in silence while a 7-year-old read his father's name off a wall she put there, and not one of those people ever walked past anybody without looking again.